So let's look at the main differences between some patterns we see in North Africa and the Middle East. And so here is the religion map. Once again, dark green is Muslim. Green is Muslim. The darker the green means more percentage of the population is Muslim. So when you see much of Northern Africa and the Middle East, as you can see, they're dark green, and that's because they're very Muslim, but very high percentage of the population is Muslim. As you get to Central Asia, you find Muslims, but it starts to fade away. And we'll talk more about that in a future discussion on Central Asia. But the Middle East here in red, the North Africa here in yellow, you can see throughout this region, the one common characteristic overwhelmingly is the Muslim faith. But not so fast, my friend. There's more to that story than meets the eye. So that in the case of religion, we definitely see a large percentage of the population Muslim. A huge percentage of the population that's Muslim. So we can really, now that we zoom in and now focus in on that area, we can really see that. Northern Africa, we can see how the Sahel, this transition zone, really does a good job of transitioning from the physical environment, desert to forest, but also Muslim to non-Muslim or Christian. So as we go further north, we can see Christian. Further to the east, we see Hindu. And so we can see this huge swath of area here, which is overwhelmingly Muslim and pretty devout Muslim. But like I said, that's not the full picture. So we can't think, this is a bunch of Muslims, they must all get along. Nope, not the case. So if we go ahead and we zoom into this particular map here, what it shows is the green, the light green, or almost yellow looking, are Sunni Muslims. So Sunni Muslims are found in greater numbers throughout the whole entire world, but also this region. But what you see in dark green is what they call Shiites or Shias. So a different version of the Muslim faith. And I'm not going to go through the intricacies, but it's somewhere in the 600s is when they had their split. And it's just it's based on who should be the leader of the religion. Should it be someone that carries on the genetics from a particular religious leader, or should it be just anybody? And so that's the basic idea of what's the difference between the two. But they don't really fully like each other. That's a whole other thing. So like I said, dark green, so we can see Iran, parts of Iraq, parts of Yemen, Azerbaijan up there north of Iran, and parts of Afghanistan. You can see the Shiite population is there. We go ahead and we zoom in to the Middle East. We can see this particular area. So one of the things I really want to emphasize is the fact that we think of this area being a lot of conflict, and I've already mentioned the fact that a lot of that conflict's from outside forces. So it's from those British, the French ruling the area, then over time, the Soviets and the Americans. Well, when we look at this particular area of the world going forward, Saudi Arabia versus Iran will be a conflict to really look out for, continue to pay attention to. And they're the two big powers in this particular area, one being Sunni and the other being predominantly Shia. So that's one thing we have going on here, is a little bit of friction from the two main powers in the Middle East and their differences in terms of religion. So there's this area that's now kind of popping up called the Shiite Crescent. So it's just kind of these areas that you're starting to see more Shiite influence. A lot of that's related to an increasingly more influential, I wouldn't say really powerful, but just so at the global level, Iran's becoming a bigger deal. So they have more of an influence because they have kind of this view, they're viewed with a little bit of power. So what's happening is they're starting to influence areas. And so you're starting to see Syria in particular being influenced by the Iranians. And then down here, you're starting to see more down here in Yemen, some more Shiites. And so what's happening is it's kind of this Shiite crescent within a whole amount, whole huge swath of Sunni religious followers kind of popping up here geographically. So that's something to kind of keep in mind going forward. Go ahead and we zoom in. There are some differences. There are some areas where in the Middle East and North Africa where you don't see Muslims. And that's just really right here in the Caucasus Mountains. And so that mountain range up in the north, it's in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, that separates the Middle East to the south and Russia and Eastern Europe to the north. And so right through the that area where the mountain range is, you find in Georgia, the country of Georgia, which is this country right there, you actually find Christians. And in the country to the south of it, the country that produced their Kardashians, Armenia, they have their own church. It's kind of an offshoot of Christianity called the Armenian Apostolic Church. And so there are some places that we don't see the Muslim faith here in the Middle East. In the case of Armenia, where the Kardashians are from, that church, it's like a state religion. So they actually have a state religion, so much they want to emphasize their faith and kind of distinguish them from their heavily Muslim neighbors. So that's one area of the Middle East where you don't see Muslims. You see some Christians scattered through there. Other areas where you see non-Muslims, you see some Christians up there in Lebanon. So some Christians in Lebanon. So a lot of them have fled over time. They've been persecuted. They've left. Some have stayed, but a lot of them left. Egypt has some Coptic Christians. You don't see any blue on the map, but you see a good amount of Coptic Christians. And so some of those, unfortunately, were beheaded by ISIS. Because ISIS, they're terrorists who really don't like non-Muslims. In the case of the Coptic Christians, they beheaded them, which is obviously a tragedy. Then we have the big one here, and that's Israel. That's obviously Jewish. So in the case of religion, this is definitely a hot area in terms of tension. And I'll come back and I'll explain this in a future lecture, the whole Palestine versus Israel thing. But the big idea is you have Israeli Jews occupying the same area, the same state, the same country as Muslims, Palestinians there. So, adding kind of the fuel to the conflict. Not only do we have Jewish and Muslims living here, but really Judaism, Jewish faith, Islam and Christianity, Islam and Christianity, all of them, their origins of religion is in this part of the world. So it only adds to more of the kind of the fuel to the fire of conflict that's so common in this particular area. So we kind of differentiate some of the main ideas in terms of religion, the main differences. We pointed out those different pockets of Christians, the Jews there in Israel, but the mostly dominated Muslim that has that Shia kind of crescent from Iran to Syria to Yemen, amongst a Sunni overwhelming majority there in this part of the world. So religion would flesh that one out pretty nicely here. Now let's look at ethnicity. And so ethnicity, we can kind of connect it with language. So we'll just do that. So we'll start off with Arabs. So most of the time when people think of the Middle East, North Africa, they think of it as being largely Arabic in terms of language, but also ethnicity, which is true. But I want to go ahead and emphasize that not every Muslim is an Arab. Now, every Arab, for the most part, is Muslim. But not every Muslim is Arab. We're going to find Muslims in Southeast Asia. We're going to find Muslims in South Asia. We're going to find Muslims all over the place. So it doesn't mean if you're Muslim that you speak Arabic and are an Arab. But like I said, every Arab is Muslim for the most part. So what we have here is a map that shows different dialects. So although the majority of the population is Arabic, as far as the dialects, they have a lot of regional variations. Dialects is just a regional vocabulary. For example, in the United Kingdom and Great Britain, they speak English, but for example, if you ordered fish and chips, you wouldn't get potato chips. You get French fries because they call chips differently than what we call them. So it's a different dialect, different words, different words with the same meaning. So essentially, we have different dialects, and a lot of it overlaps with the physical environment. But if you can note, if you see one thing up there in the northern part of the Middle East, in the eastern part, you see Iran, and you see Turkey, in which they're not shaded. So the Arabic population is overwhelmingly North Africa and the Middle East, not including Turkey and Iran. If we would say what is the core of the Arabic population, Saudi Arabia and Egypt have always been the core of this contiguous area of Arabic ethnic people. So there are some exceptions, there are some pockets here and there, but for the most part we can see that this is an area that's heavily Arabic, but also, relating to a previous map, also Sunni. So high numbers of the Sunni Muslims compared to Shiites. I show this because it really shows the complexity of ethnicity. So we really don't need to focus in on what the colors mean, but we can kind of see parts. So the moral of the story is try dividing up the area. Try getting out your straight edge and saying, okay, we're going to call this area, and all the people that are going to be in this area are going to be the same. And then over here, all the people are going to be... No, it's impossible. There's no way you can draw boundaries here without having multiple nations within one state, which is part of the problem from the British mandate and those French mandates, which essentially drew these straight lines on this map. So we look at the Middle East, much more complex than A, Muslim, B, Arabic. So let's go and take a kind of a tour of the different ethnicities we find here. So that was easy up there in the north, Turkey. So guess who lives in Turkey? The Turks. So of course this area, because of its location very close to Europe, has a lot of connections to Europe. So we could say this is the old core of the old Ottoman Empire. But in the case of Turkey, of all the Middle Eastern countries, probably the one that we would say is the most democratic. Not saying that gender equality is great there, but a little bit more free thinking, a little bit more open thinking, a little bit more wanting to connect with Europe than with the Middle East. So we don't see what we saw in the case of a lot of the other Muslim Middle Eastern countries is something called Sharia law, which essentially there is no difference between the church and the state. The church runs the state. So one of the things we're seeing a little bit of a rise is Sharia law. And that's in certain countries where they hold very true the Muslim doctrine, the Muslim rules and faith and all of that. In the case of Turkey, you're not going to see much Sharia law there. It's going to be the most open, free-thinking part of this section of the world. So that's Turkey. Typically, like I said, also a little bit more pro-Western than the rest of the Middle East. But that's kind of, sort of. Another key thing with Turkey is the two main rivers of the Middle East, the Tigris and Euphrates. They both originate there in Turkey. And so we got this complicating situation I'll come back to later in the semester. Situations in which numerous countries share the same river. So what one country does upriver is no doubt going to affect what happens downriver. And so Turkey has a lot of power because they essentially were the headwaters of those two main rivers are located. So if they decide to build a dam, then that's going to cause issues with places further downstream because they're not going to get as much water, not going to get much flow from the dam blocking it. Next up is the Kurds. The Kurds is an ethnic group that's kind of a stateless nation, or a good example of a multi-state nation, in which the nation, the Kurds, the ethnic group, the Kurds, and that ethnicity is based on some genealogical stuff, but also based on language. They speak a language. Kurdish is the language. So you can find them in northern Iraq as a minority group. You can find them in Syria as a minority group. You can find them in Turkey as a minority group. You can find them as Iran as a minority group. You can find them in Azerbaijan as a minority group. Moral of the story is here you have a group that is a minority in multiple states. And so they've always wanted to become their own state. They have ethno-nationalism. They have that separatist movement. But none of these countries are willing to give up land to appease the Kurds. So it's actually this area called Kurdistan. So it's kind of got a lot of the characteristics of the country, but no countries are willing to get rid of it. So in terms of international recognition, very few countries are going to internationally recognize Kurdistan. That's just mostly because those countries I mentioned that are the majority of where the Kurds are a minority aren't willing to give it up, and so they'll fight it. They'll prevent this area from becoming its own country, even though they have their own flag. So they have their own flag, but they're still are not their own country. Now they want to become their own country, and of course the separatist movement with strong ethno-nationalism is definitely going to be an area where we're going to see a lot of conflict. And there's no doubt that there's been a history of conflict with this group. So more recently, the conflict was from a guy named Saddam Hussein. So here's the map, and this isn't the best map, but if you follow it, you can kind of see where the Kurds live. And so this is kind of a three-dimensional map. The Kurds are in the goldish area, and Iraq here is shown in the brown area. So all this is part of Iraq for the most part. You can see that boundary going up through the northern part of Kurdistan. And so essentially in the rugged terrain areas, a theme, something I'm going to mention a few different times this semester, so I haven't mentioned already, rugged areas, mountainous areas are often where places and people can keep their culture isolated. They can essentially fight off other groups. Look at Afghanistan. Afghanistan's had numerous times in which people have been trying to fight for Afghanistan. The Soviets have, the United States have. You're not going to get much luck. It's just so rugged and so remote. In the case of the Kurds, that's pretty much their characteristic there. However, Saddam Hussein, he knows that, boy, they got some nice resources up there. And so what he did is try to take over the area by essentially ethnic cleansing. Huge amounts of mass graves. Try to kill as many people as possible. Get rid of them so that you can then take over the territory. Of course, we found out about that. We came in and saved the day, maybe a little too late, but we came in to try to fix that mess. So the Kurds are found up there in that mountainous area, very rugged, kind of isolated part of the Middle East. Now let's go over to Iran. In terms of all the countries of the world, this is probably the country that has the least religious diversity, which overwhelmingly people here are very, very, very devout Muslims. Also, what you got here culturally, you got the Persians. So the characteristic about the Persians, different language, they speak a different language than the rest of these areas. But the thing about the Persians are, they are always in conflict. The Persians are in conflict with the Jews, Persians are in conflicts with the Arabs, Persians are in conflict with people that we'll call the Western world, Western Europe, the United States. So Iran, they're always in a conflict with somebody. But we find the Persians in largest numbers there in Iran. So once again, Saudi Arabia and Iran, the conflict to look to in the future. Sunni versus Shia, Arabic versus Persian. So you can see how those cultural, those ethnic and religion tensions are only going to add to the power struggle between those two dominant countries in the Middle East, more than just oil. But like I said, Arabic, we find it pretty much everywhere. So the Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, in all places to the west, throughout North Africa, we find a large percentage of the Arabs. But there's one group I haven't mentioned, and that group is the Jews. So I will start off the very next lecture talking about, is Palestine a state, and trying to understand more about the conflict in Israel.